I apologize, folks, if you see sweat breaking out through my shirt or sweat dripping down my face. We're filming today in probably the hottest day of the summer. It's supposed to be 100 degrees, and standing here in the sun in front of the camera, it already feels like it's 100 at least. But we'll go through the material, and like I said, I apologize ahead of time for the sweat. Today, in this particular segment, we're filming in the Catskills to talk about a group of plants that are probably the most unusual types that we're going to talk about during the entire module. What you see growing on this rock, what looks like somebody painted it or put whitewash on it, is actually a plant. It's a plant called a lichen, and it is a very, very unusual plant. I mean, obviously the fact that it can grow on a rock, bare rock, makes it unusual. But even more unusual about this plant is it's actually a dual organism. That is to say, a lichen plant is really composed of two different types of organisms. In fact, two groups that we've already talked about. A lichen is composed of an algae and a fungi living in a very unusual symbiotic relationship called mutualism. Now, by mutualism, what they mean is that each member of the association, that is the algae and the fungi, benefit each other. And more importantly with mutualism, they must live together. Mutualism is obligatory. That means they are obliged to live together. They can't live separately. If you were to dissect out the algae away from the lichen or the fungi away from the lichen, they wouldn't survive. Now, this mutualistic relationship means that basically a lichen is a self-contained package. What the algae provides for the fungi is glucose that they make through photosynthesis, in other words, a carbon source. What the fungi provides for the algae is that as the algal cells die, and they're mostly single-celled green algae, as those algal cells die, the fungi decomposes and recycles the nutrients back to the algae to use again in photosynthesis and to build new organic compounds. The fungi also tends to retain moisture. Obviously, this is very important in such a harsh habitat as this rock surface. Because of this self-contained nature, and because of the fact that they can survive in the harshest of climates, lichens are very widespread. Again, most people don't even notice them, but there are about 20,000 species of lichens, which means they're very successful. They exist all the way from the Arctic Circle to the tropics. Also, they rely on their nutrients, their nutrient source, primarily from rain or from the air around them. In other words, they don't really need soil, so that they can grow on such sterile substrate as we mentioned, this rock, or you'll commonly see them growing on tree trunks and in such harsh habitats as the Arctic tundra. Their growing on rock surfaces is very important in terms of the initiation of soil formation. As these lichens grow on this surface, as a byproduct of metabolism, they release organic acids. Now, it's not something we can see, and it's a process that takes millions of years. But these organic acids slowly etch away at the surface of the rock. Now, as they do so, they create little crevices and cracks in the rock, which allows rain, wind, and other forces of nature, the freezing, thawing cycle of water, to get in, to break more and more of this rock up, and very, very slowly initiate soil formation. Of course, as the lichens die, they add a little organic matter to that newly formed soil. This sets the stage for primary succession, in that after a long period of time, other types of plants can start to move in, perhaps some mosses or grasses or ferns, eventually shrubs, etc., the process known as ecological succession. Now, lichens are also a very important food source, and these lichens in certain habitats become the only food source available to the organisms. In the hard, almost seemingly endless winters of the Arctic Circle, almost no food is available for, in North America, the caribou, and their ecological equivalents in Europe, the reindeer. In fact, if it weren't for the lichens, it would be almost impossible for these large mammals to survive. But there's a special type of lichen called reindeer moss. And by the way, it doesn't only grow in the Arctic Circle. There's quite a bit of reindeer moss all around us in the area that we're filming. In fact, that's why we picked this site. This reindeer moss, and by the way, moss is a misnomer. It's actually a lichen, provides almost the sole source of food. Reindeer and caribou are able to scrape down through the snow and the ice, paw through it, and get down to these lichens, and that becomes almost their sole source of nutrition during those long, long winter months. Now, lichens are very important also as ecological indicators. Since lichens rely almost exclusively on air for their life support, they're very sensitive to any changes in air quality, and as I mentioned, make excellent ecological indicators because of that. As far as the types of lichens are concerned, there are basically three types. The first type I showed you on the rock that I was holding at the beginning of this segment, and it's also growing on this rock, is a type of lichen known as a crustose lichen. And it grows as a crust on the rock surface, hence the name crustose. The second type, or the second group, are the foliose lichens. They get their name because their growth pattern is sort of a foliage, leaf-like growth pattern. In fact, the reindeer moss that we were just talking about, or reindeer lichens, are a type of foliose lichen. The third group of lichens are known as fruticose lichens. Now, they get their name from the fact that the fungi part of the lichen forms fruiting bodies. Now, what they mean by fruiting bodies are reproductive bodies in which they produce spores. They're largely responsible for dissemination, spreading of lichens from area to area through the spores. Oddly enough, spores that are formed, and by the way, they're sexual spores, have within them algal cells, those little green single-celled algae. So when that spore germinates in another area away from the original plant, not only is the fungi there, it's the spore, but it also has the algae so that the symbiosis and mutualism can start immediately within that new lichen. We have a couple of types of small fruticose types here growing around us. The one that I'm picking up is known as a pixie cup. Some of the other types of fruiting bodies form small, bright red fruiting bodies at the tip, and they're called British soldiers. Today we're in the Catskills at a relatively high elevation. In fact, one of the tallest peaks, Slide Mountain, is right behind us. And we're filming along the banks of the Esopus Creek, probably one of the most famous trout streams in the world. Today we want to talk about a group of plants called the bryophytes that includes the mosses and the liverworts. The mosses, I'm sure you're aware of. Most people know about mosses, but the liverworts are a lesser-known group. These plants are very transitional, that is, between water and land, and we'll talk about that transitional nature later on. Now, the bryophytes are considered the most advanced of the lower plants. They're considered advanced because the bryophytes still form embryos. They're considered lower plants because they have no vascular tissue. That is, they have no internal support, and as you'll see in a few moments, this has greatly limited their distribution on land because the vascular tissue provides support and internal transport for higher plants, and of course the mosses and liverworts don't have that. Another major limitation is that the bryophytes do not have pollen, that is, the sperm still has to swim from the male plants to the female plants. Now, we'll talk about the mosses first since they're the best known. And remember that when we're talking about the mosses, we're talking about plants that live in very confined habitat. Because they require a lot of moisture for reproduction, for sexual reproduction, you'll usually find them in darker areas in the forest. Now, because of this, they've evolved to photosynthesize efficiently at relatively low light intensities. Now let's move down and take a look at some of these moss plants so we can get an idea of exactly what the plant body or the thallus of the plant looks like. Here's a collection of mosses in front of us, and you'll notice that this first group of mosses, you can see that they do have leafy-like and stem-like structures. They're not vascular, and that's why they're so small, because they have no support. But those leafy-like projections in the stalks do have chlorophyll, and they can photosynthesize. The male plants, the thallus of the plant, contains reproductive structures called antheridia, and these antheridia internally form sperm. The female plants, on the other hand, have reproductive structures called archegonia, and internally these archegonia form eggs or ova. Now, the archegonia has evolved to be perfectly suited for reproduction with motile sperm. There's a bowl-shaped section of the archegonia in which the ovum or egg lies. Then there's a neck canal that comes up out of the archegonium that ultimately the sperm must swim from the male plant to the female plant down through that neck into the bowl-shaped area of the archegonia and fertilize the egg. Now, you would think it would be very difficult for sperm to swim across these plants from one point to another point for fertilization. But remember that in these colonies of mosses, that the male and female plants grow in very tight groups, so that actually the swimming of the sperm, the distance it swims, is very, very short. It may be as little as a couple of millimeters, so that fertilization is not all that difficult a process. But if you recall, I said they're very limited by moist habitat, and of course one of the reasons is they have to have moisture, the sperm do, to swim from the male to the female plant. Now, once that sperm penetrates in through the archegonia to the egg, a zygote is formed, and since that zygote is retained by the female portion of the plant, it forms an embryo. As I mentioned, these are the first groups of plants to form an embryo. Now, the embryo is retained within the female plant. In higher forms that we'll talk about in subsequent lectures, this embryo is surrounded by a seed, of course, and ultimately that seed can be distributed and dispersed away from the plants. In this case, the embryo is retained, and from the embryo develops the asexual stage. That's the sporophyte stage, and in fact, you can see these small brushy structures sticking up out of the thallus of the moss plants. These brushy structures are the sporophytes. And if you notice at the very tip of the sporophyte, there's a small sac-like structure called a capsule. It's actually a modified sporangium. And inside that capsule, asexual spores are formed. Now remember, the sperm and egg in the moss plants and the gametophytes was sexual reproduction. These spores that are formed in the capsule are asexual spores. When they're mature, the capsule ruptures. There's some ruptured capsules right here, and from which the spores have already been liberated. These spores fall to the ground, and when conditions are favorable, they will then develop back into new moss plants. Now, mosses have a great deal of ecological importance. One of the major imports of the moss plants is as food for other organisms. Mosses, for example, are important as food for insects, for certain types of small mammals, and for certain types of birds. Mosses are also very important as a food source for other types of organisms as well. Mosses are part of succession, primary succession on land, a little bit of what we talked about when we discussed the lichens. Mosses are the next stage in primary succession in a terrestrial habitat, and along with the lichens, they help prepare the ground for other stages in succession. Not only do they initiate soil production along with the lichens, but as these mosses die and decompose, they also provide organic matter. And since they grow in very tight clumps, they tend to retain this soil and organic matter. That is, they tend to prevent erosion of that soil. Now, following the moss stage, depending on how much light is available to that habitat, you might see grasses start to develop now that there's soil and organic matter available. You may see ferns, if it's a shadier area, start to develop, and ultimately into the shrub and tree and grass stage. Probably the greatest importance, however, of the mosses is associated with one genus called sphagnum.